Homeownership was supposed to be a dream, not a constant battle. The community where I lived looked perfect on the surface: manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, matching fences, and freshly painted homes that made it look like something out of a real estate magazine. But beneath that polished exterior was a homeowners association with a reputation for squeezing residents dry with fees, nitpicking over the smallest details, and bullying anyone who dared to push back. I had always tried to stay under the radar. My yard was tidy, my house painted within the approved color palette, and I never made noise after hours. But one Monday morning, I received a notice in my mailbox with a bright red header: violation fee, $1,000. My crime? Leaving my trash cans out at the curb overnight. It wasn't as if I had abandoned a broken-down car on the lawn or built a neon sign in my yard. It was a couple of bins that the garbage company had not picked up until late in the evening. I had gone to bed, planning to wheel them in the next morning. Somehow, that tiny oversight had ballooned into a $1,000 punishment. I knew this wasn't about the bins. It was about control. The HOA board thrived on intimidation, and I had just become their latest target. Many neighbors whispered about excessive fines and unfair enforcement, but few were brave enough to resist. I wasn't sure if I was brave yet, but I was angry. The first instinct was to pay it off, grumble, and move on. That's how they wanted it to be. But as I read the violation letter again, something caught my eye. The fine amount was unusually high. Most associations capped fines for minor infractions at $50 or maybe $100, but $1,000? That number didn't make sense. I pulled out the community bylaws, which every resident had received when moving in. Buried in the legal jargon, I found the section on fines. The maximum penalty for a first offense trash violation was listed clearly: $50. The only way to escalate was repeated offenses within 30 days. Yet here was a demand for 20 times that amount. It wasn't just unfair. It was illegal by their own rules. That was the moment something shifted in me. I decided I wasn't just going to fight this fine. I was going to find out what else the HOA had been hiding. If they thought they could intimidate me into submission, they were about to learn just how wrong they were. I began with the simplest step: talking to neighbors. Casual conversations revealed a pattern. One woman had been fined $300 for having a flower pot in the wrong color scheme. Another family had been charged $200 for holiday lights left up past January 10th, even though several board members had their own lights still hanging well into February. The more stories I gathered, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about enforcing community standards. It was about profit. The fines were being inflated, selectively enforced, and handed out disproportionately to certain homeowners who didn't have connections within the board. The HOA was operating like a private cartel, and the residents were the customers who had no choice but to pay up. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. If I wanted to expose them, I needed evidence. So I began digging deeper. Public records showed the HOA's tax filings, expense reports, and meeting minutes. They were supposed to be transparent, but what I found was sloppy at best and suspicious at worst. Line items for community improvements ran into the tens of thousands of dollars, but when I asked around, no one could recall what improvements had been made. Landscaping budgets were inflated, with payments going to a single contractor whose last name matched the HOA treasurer. It was a web of favoritism, self-dealing, and likely fraud. But I knew better than to confront them outright. If I went in guns blazing with accusations, they would dismiss me, silence me, or worse, retaliate with more fines. I needed to be methodical, quiet, patient. The trash can fine, ridiculous as it was, had become the crack in the foundation. Through it, I had glimpsed the rot beneath the HOA's pristine image. I knew there was more to uncover, much more. The next step would be risky: attending a board meeting, not as a passive observer, but as someone ready to ask uncomfortable questions. I wasn't sure how far they would go to protect themselves, but I was about to find out. And with every piece of evidence I collected, I could feel something building, a storm that the HOA would never see coming. The day of the board meeting arrived, and I could feel the tension hanging over me before I even stepped inside the clubhouse. Normally, HOA meetings were sparsely attended, 10 chairs set up in a room that could hold 50, with most residents preferring to stay home rather than endure hours of dry reports and self-congratulation from the board. But this time, the room was fuller than usual. Word of my $1,000 trash can fine had spread quickly, and curiosity had drawn others in. Some came just to watch, others because they too had been burned. The board sat at the front like judges behind a long table. Their president, a smug man with a taste for authority, shuffled papers and adjusted his glasses as if preparing for battle. The treasurer and secretary whispered to one another. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood gathering and more like a trial. And in a way, it was, only this time, I wasn't the one on trial. They were. When the agenda moved to new business, I raised my hand. The president tried to brush me off, but too many eyes were on him for him to deny me the floor. I stood, paper in hand, and calmly read from the HOA bylaws. The maximum fine for a trash can violation, $50. Not $1,000. 50. Then I produced the letter demanding payment of 20 times that amount. The contradiction was undeniable. Murmurs spread through the room. Residents leaned forward, some shaking their heads, others exchanging knowing glances. For years they had suspected foul play, but suspicion had never been laid out in black and white like this. The president fumbled for a response, claiming it must have been a clerical error. But the treasurer's stiff expression told another story. If it was an error, it was one that happened far too often, and always to the benefit of the board. That was my first strike, but I wasn't finished. I shifted to the HOA's financials, which were public record yet rarely examined. I asked about the inflated landscaping expenses. Why was a single contractor being paid nearly triple the going rate for lawn maintenance? Why was the community improvement budget so large when no one could name a single recent improvement? The room grew restless. Neighbors who had once avoided conflict were now emboldened, raising their own questions. What about the sudden spike in monthly dues? Where had last year's pool repair budget gone, when the pool remained untouched? The board squirmed. They gave vague answers, citing ongoing projects and unexpected costs. But the more they tried to explain, the weaker they sounded. The curtain had been pulled back, and for the first time, the residents saw their so-called leaders not as guardians of order, but as opportunists caught in a lie. Of course, I knew this was only the beginning. Exposing a single fine discrepancy and a few suspicious expenses wasn't enough to topple them. They still held the legal authority of the association, the power to issue notices, and the intimidation factor they had built for years. If I truly wanted to bring them down, I needed more than questions. I needed proof. That night, I doubled down on my research. Every bylaw, every financial report, every newsletter, they all became puzzle pieces I laid out on my dining table. Patterns began to emerge. The treasurer's family name appeared again and again in the list of contractors paid by the HOA. The secretary's cousin owned a printing company that mysteriously charged double for simple mailings. The president's signature appeared on contracts approved without any recorded votes. They weren't just sloppy. They were self-serving. And in their arrogance, they had left behind a trail. Neighbors began approaching me privately, emboldened by what I had done at the meeting. Some shared old letters they had kept, violation notices with outrageous fines that had never been consistent with the bylaws. Others whispered about shady behavior, board members using association funds for personal expenses, or holding meetings in secret that should have been open to residents. The picture grew clearer each day. The HOA wasn't simply enforcing rules unfairly. They were running the neighborhood as their own personal business, pocketing money where they could and punishing anyone who dared resist. But if I was going to expose them, I had to tread carefully. Case of power, real legal power. They could slap liens on properties, threaten foreclosure, or bury residents in fines. I couldn't just scream corruption into the wind and hope people believed me. I needed irrefutable evidence that could withstand scrutiny. So I took the next step, requesting full access to the HOA's records. Legally, homeowners had the right to view contracts, meeting minutes, and financial statements. Of course, the board tried to stall, citing delays and missing files. But I was relentless, filing formal requests, documenting every denial, and reminding them that failure to comply was itself a violation of state law. Weeks passed. Tension in the neighborhood grew thicker with each day. The board had hoped my outrage would fade, but instead it spread like wildfire. More residents started attending meetings. More questions were asked. The once untouchable board members began looking over their shoulders. Finally, after relentless pressure, a box of documents arrived on my doorstep. They were messy, incomplete, and clearly hastily compiled, but they were enough. Enough to reveal contracts signed without bids, payments to family-owned businesses, and thousands of dollars in miscellaneous expenses, with no receipts to back them up. It was the smoking gun. But exposing them wouldn't be as simple as dropping the papers on a table. If I wanted real change, I needed to rally the entire neighborhood. And to do that, I would need to be smart, methodical, and unshakable. The trash can fine had started as a petty annoyance, but it had led me here, to the brink of unraveling an empire built on greed and intimidation. I didn't know it yet, but the next step would push everything into motion. The battle lines had been drawn, and soon there would be no turning back. The stack of documents on my kitchen table felt heavier than paper. Each page was a piece of the puzzle, and together they painted a picture of a board that had long since abandoned its duty to the community. Mismanaged funds, self-dealing contracts, and unexplained expenses, it was all there in black and white. But papers alone weren't enough. If I presented them the wrong way, the board could spin it, bury it, or intimidate the residents into silence. I knew this wasn't just about facts. It was about power. And the only way to break theirs was to unite the neighborhood against them. I started small, sharing what I had uncovered with the people I trusted most, neighbors who had already confided their own horror stories about inflated fines and selective enforcement. When they saw the documents, their frustration turned into outrage. Word spread, and soon I was receiving knocks on my door from homeowners who had once been too afraid to speak. They wanted to see for themselves. They wanted to know what the board had been hiding. I began organizing informal gatherings, not in the sterile clubhouse where the board reigned, but in living rooms, garages, and backyards. We compared notes. We tallied fines, cross-checked invoices, and pieced together timelines. The pattern was undeniable. The HOA had been siphoning money and enforcing rules unevenly to cover their tracks. The momentum built quickly. What had begun as my personal battle over a trash can fine was now a neighborhood movement. People were tired of living under constant fear of the next violation notice. They were tired of watching their money disappear into vague improvements that never materialized. And most of all, they were tired of the arrogance of a board that thought they were untouchable. But the board wasn't blind. They could feel the shift. Notices began showing up in my mailbox with increasing frequency, warnings about yard maintenance, threats of additional fines, vague accusations of non-compliance. They were trying to break me down, to remind me of their authority. But instead of cowering, I kept documenting everything. Each letter became more fuel for the fire. The turning point came when I decided to go public. At the next HOA meeting, I didn't walk in alone. Dozens of residents followed me, packing the room to the point that people stood along the walls. The board looked rattled before the meeting even began. They were used to empty chairs, not a crowd demanding answers. I took my seat, waited for the agenda to roll forward, and when the floor opened, I stood with a binder in my hands. Page by page, I laid out the evidence. The overcharged landscaping contracts tied to the treasurer's family. The inflated printing bills funneled to the secretary's cousin. The unexplained miscellaneous expenses that conveniently lined up with personal purchases. And finally, the proof that fines, including my own, had been issued far beyond what the bylaws permitted. The room buzzed with anger. Neighbors gasped, muttered, shook their heads. The board tried to interrupt, tried to spin, but every excuse fell flat under the weight of paper trails and receipts. The treasurer stammered about miscommunication. The secretary mumbled about clerical oversight. The president tried to deflect, blaming past boards and system errors. But no one was buying it. For years, the residents had been intimidated into silence. But now, with proof in front of them and strength in numbers, the fear began to dissolve. People who had once avoided confrontation were suddenly demanding resignations. Voices rose, and the balance of power in the room shifted. By the end of the meeting, the board was cornered. They tried to adjourn abruptly, but the residents refused to leave until action was promised. A petition was drafted on the spot, calling for a recall vote to remove the current board members. Nearly every homeowner in the room signed it. The following weeks were tense. The board scrambled to salvage their image, sending out newsletters filled with hollow reassurances and half-truths. But the damage was done. Their authority had cracked, and the community had found its voice. When the recall vote finally came, it wasn't even close. The president, treasurer, and secretary were removed from their positions, replaced by residents who had once been too afraid to speak but were now determined to bring fairness back to the neighborhood. As for the $1,000 trash can fine, it was erased, along with dozens of others that had been issued improperly. Refunds were ordered. Transparency measures were put in place. And slowly, the community began to heal from the years of corruption. Looking back, it was almost laughable that it all started with a pair of trash cans. Something so trivial had pulled at a thread that unraveled an entire web of greed and intimidation. But that was the lesson. Sometimes the smallest fights reveal the biggest injustices. The board had built their empire on the assumption that no one would ever question them, that fear would always keep residents compliant. But they underestimated the power of one homeowner refusing to back down, and the strength of a community united once the truth was finally exposed. What they thought would be my punishment became their downfall. And in the end, justice wasn't just served, it was reclaimed by the very people they had tried to silence.